Like many poets these days, I teach, and I find myself spending as much time dismantling the idea of a poem as I do building it up. I know right away whether or not I think a poem is any good, but saying why is more difficult. It's easier to talk about what can go wrong, and so easier to advise students what not to do than what to do.
The immediate necessity is to tabulate a list of don'ts for those beginning to write verses.
In 1913, the American poet, critic and editor Ezra Pound published a brief, provocative essay called A Few Don'ts by an Imagiste in a new journal called Poetry, which he had helped set up.
Use either no ornament or good ornament.
The magazine was based in Chicago, and as he was living in London, he styled himself its foreign correspondent.
Go in fear of abstraction.
He clearly felt that a collective identity and collective action were what were needed to shake up the moribund literary world he found here.
It's not entirely certain that now we have a collective identity as artists and writers and a sense of shared purpose. So one of the admirable things about Pound is that he had that certainty, that he wanted to absolutely break through the mediocrity of criticism and verse and point a new way to the future by really breaking everything apart.
Ezra Pound was 28. He had come to Europe having dropped out of a series of colleges and having been sacked from his teaching job. Throughout his education, he resisted the curriculum, confident that he knew what was really worth learning. His don'ts have a young man's swagger and a young idealist's rigour.
Don't imagine that a thing will go in verse just because it's too dull to go in prose.
100 years on, what do they mean? The poets Richard Price and Francis Leviston.
One of the really interesting things for me about A Few Don'ts is the authority of it. And I suppose that's what gets people's backs up. And also the excitement too. The essay is really didactic and commanding and imperious.
Use no superfluous word, no adjective which does not reveal something.
It's very browbeating. He says that this is meant to help people beginning to write. There is no way that this would help people beginning to write. This is a confusing, authoritarian piece. It's a bit like a mad headmaster.
Pound barged his way into literary circles, acquiring a reputation for breaking chairs because he was so unable to sit still. William Carlos Williams described him as a headlong, ragged nature, always hurting people's feelings, but he has, I think, some genius and great goodwill. His voice is too loud, his stride too resounding.
I think he is very confrontational about that basic disciplinary issue at the root of writing poems. Are you approaching this as self-expression, or are you approaching this as a tradition that you want to be part of? And if you're approaching it as a tradition, then you need to, in some ways, submit to the form.
Frustrated by what he'd found at home, Pound was even more disappointed by what he found in London, a place he described as being as dead as mutton. Elsewhere, modernism was finding its form. 1913 was the year of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, of Duchamp and Picasso at the Armory Show, of quantum theory and Ford's first assembly line. In the midst of all this, Pound found England a conservative place. Andrea Brady is a poet and critic.
He found a lot of the air of poetry, the mystique and atmosphere of poetry, people who think that simply having some inspiration or being in the right sort of mood or wearing the right sorts of clothes makes them into poets. And for him, you have to actually be a master of the technique of poetry. You actually have to study very deeply and intensely the entire European tradition. So starting with the Greeks, moving on to the troubadours, through Dante and Chaucer, through to the present day.
Be influenced by as many great artists as you can, but have the decency either to acknowledge the debt outright or to try to conceal it.
While Pound famously urged poets to make it new, he was equally insistent that it's out of deep engagement with the poetry that has already been written that we learn how to be original. Pound's biographer, David Moody.
Don't do again What Homer has done, what Dante has done, what Shakespeare has done, that's there in the tradition, that's available to us. In order to keep renewing the intelligence, you've got to find new ways of expressing your perceptions, the perceptions of your time.
So, in fact, by writing a few don'ts rather than a few do's, he's being less instructive than he might be.
He's being critical, and there are quite a lot of do's among the don'ts. The don'ts are: don't write vague, watery language, avoid abstractions, be definite and precise, don't always bring in adjectives. Those were the don'ts. But behind this there was, try to find the musical form, try to find the exact word, the precise word.
Poetry is particularly good at articulating the complex, the contingent, the ambivalent, and the opaque, but it does this by being exact.
Don't use such an expression as dim lands of peace. It dulls the image.
The image is an extraordinarily powerful way to use words, because what the reader experiences isn't the words, but the thing. In order for this to work, the image has to make absolute sense. Then the reader trusts it. It's about giving the reader something to experience, rather than describing an experience to them.
Don't be descriptive. Remember that the painter can describe a landscape much better than you can, and that he has to know a deal more about it.
It's probably still taught in schools, it was certainly taught to me, that a noun is a naming word, a verb is a doing word, and an adjective is a describing word. And that poetry is descriptive writing. Therefore, poetry means using lots of adjectives. And when you start putting kind of strings of adjectives in front of words, rather than making the image appear more clearly, it actually mutes it. Because if I am asking you to imagine a table, but it's a table that's red with carved legs, and it's ornate, and it's baroque, and it's metal, it actually takes you a really long time to process all of the adjectives before you arrive at a correct image of the table. Whereas if I just say imagine a table, bang, it's there. And I think speed and the sudden apprehension of something is really important to what Pound is talking about.
Any beginner's workshop will probably suggest the poet adopts a rule of show, don't tell, which is a simplified version of what Pound prescribes. As well as being against description, he is against abstraction. We release vast balloons of love, grief, joy, which fill the air with air, whereas the reader needs something to grasp, something that activates the senses.
I think that's perhaps best illustrated by one of Pound's own poems, if I can quote from that. The poem is called The Encounter, and that was from the book Lustra, which was published around a similar time to A Few Don'ts. And it's very short. The Encounter. All the while they were talking the new morality, her eyes explored me. And when I arose to go, her fingers were like the tissue of a Japanese paper napkin. So that the talk about morality is going on, but what the poet and the poem are interested in is not that at all. It's not this abstract argument about ethics, but it's the specific texture of the woman's hands and the kind of erotic charge that comes from that moment.
The reader is presented with the image and left to decide what to do with it. Pound's not saying that we should never use abstraction, only that we should treat it with great caution. It could easily overpower the poet, like the metronome.
An example of the kind of poetry that drove Pound absolutely up the wall is Rupert Brooke's The Fish, which was published in the Georgian Anthology in 1912. And I'll just read a couple of lines from that. In a cool curving world he lies and ripples with dark ecstasies. The kind luxurious lapse in steel shapes all his universe to feel and know and be. The clinging stream closes his memory, glooms his dream. It's full of extra words, adjectives that don't really tell us very much about the specificity of a stream or a fish, but are just there really to fill up the meter.
Don't chop your stuff into separate iambs. Don't make each line stop dead at the end and then begin every next line with a heave.
And in these lines we can hear Brooke know and be. The clinging stream closes his memory, glooms his dream. Just using extra words to kind of make that 5-beat line.
Which is a mistake of many of us when we start writing, to be led by music.
But is it music or just the necessity of the convention of the 5-beat line, the iambic pentameter that's inherited from history?
Pound urges the poet to compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of the metronome. Again, he's addressing our susceptibilities. Once we've fallen into a beat, it's hard to resist. It gives us confidence and momentum, which can lead us all too easily into the de-dum of regular beats. Sophie Scott, Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience, specialises in the non-verbal aspects or noise of speech.
One of the main things that you're doing that's actually driving the rhythm of the speech you're producing is how you're breathing. Everything that you're able to do in terms of human speech at all is because the way that we breathe. And we do you can hear me now, I take a breath in, and then as I start to speak, what I'm doing is using my intercostal muscles to squeeze air up through the larynx. And whenever I'm saying a syllable, I'm actually doing a little bit more of that because you're voicing at some point during the syllable. Now, if I keep speaking without taking another breath, you'll hear, well, that doesn't end because I'm squeezing the air out. I can't do it anymore. But that's sort of giving you that phrase level structure.
And one of the things that excites me most about what you're saying is the physicality of it all, that these things we think of as components of language, components of poetry, come from ourselves, our bodily selves, rather than our idea of speech.
I think that's probably one of the main things that I've had to come to realise through working in this area for as long as I have done, is the bodily aspect of it, that embodied aspect. 20 years ago, I would have said rhythm was something more to do with an internal clock, and now I can see it's to do with the motor act of doing these things. In fact, if you put things on a flat rhythm, people don't like it. People working with recording music find MIDI recordings very irritating because they just go tick, 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 and there's no expressivity.
Let the candidate fill his mind with the finest cadences he can discover, preferably in a foreign language, so that the meaning of the words may be less likely to divert his attention from the movement, e.g., Saxon charms, Hebridean folk songs, the verse of dance and lyrics of Shakespeare. If he can dissociate the vocabulary from the cadence, in short, behave as a musician, a good musician.
In 1913, composers such as Berg, Schoenberg, Stravinsky were countering the weight of the Austro-Hungarian Romanticism of the late 19th century, consciously manipulating ideas of influence and authorship. John Woolrich is a composer.
One of the key things about all the arts at that time, being in the 20th century, is a sort of depersonalisation of masks. So people like Yeats and Eliot and Pound would maybe assume a character which wasn't theirs, or they'd hide their own personality behind a mask. And certainly you could see that in composers like Stravinsky, who would use various different styles to work behind. And Ravel would be the same kind of thing. Ravel is always composing behind one mask or another. So it's a kind of ancient Greek mask like Dufferin and Chloe, or it's a jazz style that he's working within. So the poets and the composers were both slightly obscuring themselves.
Consider the way of the scientists, rather than the way of an advertising agent for a new soap.
Pound wanted to provide a set of measures, standards, voltometers for poetry. He believed the scientist was someone who understood better than the poet their relation to the past as well as to their peers.
The scientist does not expect to be acclaimed as a great scientist until he has discovered something. He begins by learning what has been discovered already. He goes from that point onward. He does not bank on being a charming fellow personally. He does not expect his friends to applaud the results of his freshman classwork.
Pound's biographer, David Moody.
He spoke of poetry being a science in the sense that the expression of poetry should have exactly the same clarity and hardness and objectivity. It would be expressing subjective states, intuitions, even dreams of a purely subjective sort. But in order to make them have value in the world, they had to be expressed in this objective way.
An image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time.
This desire to formulate a new approach became the Imagiste movement. Pound wrote one of Imagism's and Modernism's most famous poems, which was published that year in Poetry magazine.
In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough.
These two lines give you not just an image, but an image in the making. Visually, the poem is exploded and arrested, broken down into phrases which reflect the steps of perception. The apparition. We register something that's appeared before we figure out what it is. Of these faces, particular faces surfacing out of the crowd, and then a moment of hesitation as the mind figures out what has struck it so forcefully, that they're like petals, blank and fragile and similar. On a wet black, a depth of wetness and blackness that's eventually made concrete with the word bough. The image is logical and complete.
Pound, I think, characterizes the image in two very different ways. On the one hand, it's something very compressed, very hard. He later says that poetry in the 20th century should be as much like granite as possible. And then on the other hand, he talks about literature as being charged with meaning. And he says that the book should glow like a ball of light in the reader's hand. And so there's a sense that the image is charged with a kind of electricity or energy, the same thing that shot out of the visual field into the poet's perception and made such an intense impression will also shoot into the reader's consciousness and charge them with the same kind of electricity.
Can we make a poem out of an image or images alone?
I think in a way we have inherited Pound's idea of the image as a kind of luminous detail, which is plucked out of the massive sort of distractions of contemporary life and held up for scrutiny. Now, for Pound, that luminous detail is so bright and so full of energy and so true that it doesn't require any commentary. You don't need to have a narrative setting it up. You don't need to have an interpretation from the poet telling you how to read it. And I think, unfortunately, that idea of the luminous detail, which is somehow representative of the moment that the outer world and the sensitive inner world of the poet collide and become one, that image has become, in some ways, quite trivialized in much contemporary poetry. So there's a sense that you can simply take that detail and show that it's the basis of a kind of epiphany because you're a sensitive type, and that is the whole of the poem. And I think that we should, in fact, be reaching for a grander and more intense idea of the system from which these details emerge, whether it be a material one, an economic one, a political one, or an emotional one.
I think there's another aspect to the image here, and that is he's trying to get everyone to concentrate, settle down now, concentrate on one thing. But unfortunately, poetry isn't like that. Poetry is doing lots and lots of things together. There's ambiguity, there is wit, there is deliberately being obtuse, something that my mother used to accuse me of, you're being deliberately obtuse. Exactly, of course I am. He's troubled later in the piece. He talks about ornament and how he really doesn't like ornament. Then he concedes, well, maybe good ornament is okay. But he doesn't really understand that one of the great pleasures of poetry is exactly that. Just in the same way as colour composition in painting, the Fauve of the same period, the painters in France who were wildly colouring landscapes with the wrong colours. He doesn't understand that that kind of disruption is exciting and beautiful.
The successful image feels like a release from language, even though language is what it's made from. I've often felt that I'd like to do away with language altogether and conjure the image in other ways. I envy the visual artist for whom an image can be just that. Better still, it can be an idea. The artist Cornelia Parker has, for example, dropped the dictionary definition of gravity made out of lead off the white cliffs of Dover, and more recently curated a silence.
And I thought of all the silences I might want to exhibit, perhaps a pregnant pause between two politicians in the middle of a debate. And I went through all kinds of ideas of how this silence could be manifest. And in the end, I decided just to record myself thinking. So I sat in a recording studio and I thought about explosions for 5 minutes. And then I made that into a 7-inch single, and that's what's been played in the gallery. So you get the clunkiness of the record player and that sound, but then all you get is the sound of my breath as I'm thinking.
Because I do think you're lucky that you can just make images, you can think images, and I have to write images.
Yes. But that's the craft you've worked on for a long time, and I suppose vice versa too, I mean, artists don't use words very well, I don't think. There's not enough attention paid to, I think, the link between words and images, because a lot of artists title their works badly and then ruin the work. And I used to collect, well, I still do collect titles. I'll see a phrase either in a newspaper or a book, or a found title like "Look Back in Anger" or something like that. And I'll just save them the same way I save materials, and then they worry their way through the pile and might end up being used. I think no image just exists on its own. It's always got attendant language to it. The image is just a catalyst or a trigger for me. It's just a concretion. It's just a thing.
For all Pound has to say about construction, he knew that the poem must start deep within the poet. He qualified himself. There must be intense emotion before language simplifies itself to the point of imagism.
Yuche. The rustling of the silk is discontinued. Dust drifts over the courtyard. There is no sound of footfall, and the leaves scurry into heaps and lie still, and she, the rejoicer of the heart, is beneath them. A wet leaf that clings to the threshold.
Francis Leviston.
I've never written a poem that didn't start with a feeling of excitement, a feeling of being moved, that something was kind of coming alive in my hands. And that, to me, is an intensity of sort of an emotional experience.
For me, that's a sensation. It's a physical sensation.
Yes. There's a really great, very extreme story about that. The American poet Ruth Stone said she was out working in her garden one day and she heard a poem coming, and it was like hearing a train. And she threw down her gardening tools and ran back towards the house. And she said just as she got into the house, she managed to grab hold of the end of it and she sort of hauled it in. And she wrote the poem out and it came out backwards, perfectly backwards. There's part of me that doesn't believe that at all, and part of me just thinks it's amazing and really wants it to be true.
Have you ever subscribed to a manifesto?
No.
Have you ever written one?
No.
Do you think we need manifestos?
Well, my position is that when you write a poem, you are writing a manifesto, because every poem is an expression of what the poet thinks a poem can be, or what a poem ought to be.
The unqualified statements that make up a manifesto are powerful and increasingly rare. Why be so public and so absolute in your views if you're only going to be expected to live up to them? Andrea Brady.
At the time of writing A Few Don'ts, which includes the recommendation that you shouldn't take advice from anyone unless they have written a masterwork of their own, Pound himself had written no masterworks. He'd written maybe 1 or 2 good poems. It could be argued that Pound was much more important as an editor. His attacks on the poetry of William Carlos Williams, Eliot, and W. Butler Yeats were formative in making them poets. Whether he finally achieved a kind of imagistic purity in his own work is a different question. Many of the images in the cantos have a kind of electric charge, but that charge is also diffused through a network of paranoid, complicated, as we know, fascistic political ideas and ideologies as well. So even Pound couldn't maintain that purity of the image for very long.
Pound's ideology was later so contorted that he became a supporter of fascism and anti-Semitism. He was held as a prisoner of war and incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital for 12 years. In 1913, he was borderless, protean and playful, as well as deadly serious about the art.
Now, because of the way especially more experimental poetry works, it's often difficult to feel that absolute confidence that you can intervene to make the poem new, to make it convincing, to strip away its excesses. Poems operate, I think, by a very, very complicated logic now, and it's not always possible to feel that you know you can understand that logic, that you can discriminate between what's necessary and what's unnecessary. Pound had a very intense certainty that he was right about what belonged in a poem and what didn't.
Pound cracked poetry open and helped us to tell what he called the dynamic content from the shell. A few don'ts has taken me years to understand. They are not do's. They're the kind of warning that comes out of experience, of knowledge of your own susceptibilities, and of a deep understanding of how a poem works. They're worth listening to and arguing with.
One way of answering your question is actually to offer a kind of manifesto poem, a portfolio poem, if you like. And this is about allowing things into your life. It's called In Your Generous Hours. Oh, you better not be late for enjoying the making of things. Make things includes silence. You have a license to treasure affection in the diving chamber. Poetry is massive, it's huge. It can practically do everything. Pound is the bad teacher. Luckily, I had some good teachers. What I really like is sharing, is offering you doors into things, not closing doors. Oh, you better relax. You're attached to the universe by the tenderest of chances. Make allowances. Allow me.
And is there really nothing you would tell a young poet not to do?
No.